Fake news. Who creates the fake news, and how far would a government go to create fake news? Welcome to the Film Threat Podcast. I am Chris Gore. I am pleased to talk to the directors today, Eric Petticelli and Jason Loftus. You guys are here to talk about your film, Ask No Questions, which played, I believe, at the recent Slamdance Film Festival.
Yeah, before all this craziness. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, well, thanks for coming on the Film Threat Podcast today. I saw your film and was terrified because we all hear these stories about fake news, but how far do people go to create fake news? I guess the only thing I could compare it to is something like it reminded me of Oliver Stone's JFK, the level of detail that you went to expose how this fake event was created in China and was put on blast to basically fulfill an agenda. Tell me how you got involved in it, because you're actually in a way kind of part of the story. But talk about how you got involved and what made you decide, hey, this is a feature-length documentary that has to be explored, and this fake event has to be exposed.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, for me, Eric and I came to the story from different perspectives. So, I mean, I came with a background in Falun Gong. It's something that I picked up in high school, and I was familiar with it before there was this crackdown and repression going on in China. And I came to it more because of an interest in Eastern philosophy and meditation. And then all of a sudden in China, there's this repression going on, and people who are doing this meditation that I was doing in the park, all of a sudden they're being, carted off to labor camps and detention centers. And there's this messaging from the state media saying, like, this is dangerous and we need to get rid of it. And that was the thing for me. I had very little background on Chinese politics or anything that was, what was going on in China. But what I was hearing was just completely at odds with my own experience from Falun Gong. And so my involvement just began as, there's this gap between what I've seen from Falun Gong and what the Chinese state media is saying. And maybe in some way I can step forward and kind of help to close that gap and just share my own experience, assuming at first that maybe it's misunderstandings or these types of things. But I think flash forward now, it's been 20 years since this event. And this is, I think, the most egregious example of the anti-Falun Gong kind of propaganda that took place. And Falun Gong is kind of like it's like a Chinese yoga. It looks like a kind of meditation. There's slow moving exercises in meditation. And it has some moral tenets based on truth, compassion, and tolerance. And that's what the practice was. It became very popular in the 90s. And then the government cracked down on it and said it was something that they needed to get rid of. So my involvement came from within the practice, and then kind of championing the human rights cause of those who were being imprisoned and mistreated in China. But I guess through the process, I came to learn how the media works and how the state works with any type of groups inside China that aren't part of the, that aren't under the thumb of the Chinese communist regime. So that was my involvement. And Eric?
Yeah, well, Chris, I want to go back to the reference you made to Oliver Stone's JFK. I think that's a really relevant example, because the one of the main parts of the film is this news report released by or aired by China Central Television. And we, in the film, our investigation involves breaking down footage taken, shot in Tiananmen Square, partly by security cameras, partly by a CNN reporter who was on the scene. And we analyzed the footage in a way that's similar to how the Zapruder film has been analyzed in the JFK assassination. And that's to me, I think one of the really fascinating parts of the film is how we break down the footage, things that we discover in the footage, discrepancies between the official state narrative. And I think we make some really interesting discoveries along the way.
Well, yeah, it's what I really like about what you guys did is that you let us in on the process. I don't know that you could have made this movie 20 years ago because the tools that we have, the tools we're using now to talk over a live stream, right? Like these are now common tools, but at the time that this happened, these tools weren't available. And you bring the viewer along on this journey where you show not just, that this was faked, but that how they did it, and you show the tools that you use to expose that it was fake. In a way, it's kind of it's kind of a guide for exposing fake news, or at least for questioning. And just as having been a sometime journalist, I don't know that you can call entertainment journalists, in my opinion. That's a whole other conversation. But I feel like you did such a great job of using the tools, showing how you use the tools, and how it affected you directly. Can you talk about your direct involvement in this story? You have a peripheral connection.
Right. So, I mean, as we work on this, it's funny because the film deals with these issues of like, well, why? It's not just about what happened in this event, right? But if it's not what the government had said, and if it was something that was a government plot, then how come no one has dug into this? Is it just that it's so hard to find the truth, or are there other motivating factors like, business interests and these types of things? And I think that was something that was really eye-opening for me. And then I, as you mentioned, I kind of experienced that through the film because in my business, I also make video games. We had a publishing deal with Tencent, which is one of the largest media companies in China. And we were just about to release our game. We had gotten government approvals at different layers in the Chinese government, and then things up in the store. And we're in the midst of making this movie at the same time. And all of a sudden that just disappears, and we're told that the government's gotten involved. My wife's family is contacted by the Public Security Bureau. My wife is Chinese and her family's in China. And so there's all these, it sort of brings to light because when we tried to get started on this film, we started talking to journalists who were stationed in Beijing at the time that this self-immolation event had taken place. And what we found was a lot of the journalists weren't willing to participate. A number of them were supportive. They're like, hey, this is an important thing to look at, but they were only willing to speak on background or just to give us some information, but not. And they were concerned. And then I started to realize as we worked on this, those concerns are very real. We think of media, especially, our news outlets, we think there's a lot of brave journalists. And we saw journalists in this story who were willing to be involved in, running from the police basically in order to get news out about what was going on with human rights abuses. These are people who had courage, but at the same time, it's very difficult for them to pursue a complicated story that requires an in-depth investigation because you don't know what results you're going to get. And in the end, you could jeopardize the entire business operations. And these foreign bureaus exist in China and in other authoritarian countries to provide a steady flow of information, not to get to the bottom of one story. And so it's very difficult. They're in a very difficult situation. And that would really hit home during the production of this film.
And Chris, if I can just quickly go back to something you said at the very beginning of that question, you made the point that we kind of brought the audience into the investigation with us. And that's something that we decided very early on that we were going to make the investigation subjective from Jason's point of view. And in that sense, we bring the audience into the investigation with us. It also allows us to bring his story into play and the process of making the film and what threats he faces. But we also aesthetically tried to bring the audience into the edit suite with us so that they could participate in the critical analysis and kind of make up their own mind as to what they think as evidence comes to light. So we kind of also sonically used sound effects that would give the impression that the audience is shuttling through the footage with us and kind of part of the editing team in a sense.
Yeah, it's a very effective storytelling method to bring the audience in on this journey and actually make them privy to. You could have just showed the results of what you discovered, but you showed the discovery, and I think that's an incredibly unique way of telling this story. How we live in this age where the term fake news is kind of thrown around willy-nilly. How have audiences reacted to seeing this now? Do people who are, does this just reaffirm skeptics? I've always been a skeptic. I always look at the mainstream media and I think, well, what's the agenda behind what they're telling me? Mm-hmm. So, but I have a healthy skepticism. I also wear a mask when I go to the store for the same reason that I wear pants and a shirt. It's socially acceptable. It's not a terrible sacrifice to wear a mask for 20 minutes to go to the grocery store, right? But there are whole groups of people that that just accept one side of the story or the other without actually, I feel like, sort of just with some critical thinking coming to maybe a more sober-minded conclusion. What are some of the audience takeaways that you noticed? Because I think the audience reaction to this film is really important.
Yeah, I mean, as filmmakers, you're always making the film for the audiences, right? You go through your own process in making a film. It isn't just sort of putting a message out there. It has to, I think, to be worthy of something that people are going to want to see. It has to be your own journey of discovery. And we certainly had our eyes open to a lot of things. So I think, there are differences in different places, like, an authoritarian regime like they have in China, where there is complete control of the media. So, here, there's relative freedom in terms of the opportunity to completely distrust one side of the media landscape or the other, right? So at least there is that. And but in China, what you have is you have one voice. And to see when there's absolute authoritarian control over the media, how far it can go in terms of misinformation or in terms of the inability to have a voice or to challenge or question anything. That to me was very eye-opening. But at the same time, I personally learned a lot about the effects of propaganda and messaging, and it's not just about in the media, but what these people endured in the brainwashing camps. They were forced to watch this thing over and over. They had people talking to them, trying to essentially change their minds. And even though the cases that we explore in the film, I think, are extreme and are not things that people are going to be experiencing themselves on a day-to-day basis in North America, I do think that it opened my eyes to the question of like, hey, well, what else do I just accept as truth? Because it's common knowledge or everyone accepts it, but it might not be that way just because we've been told that. So I definitely do think that there are things out there that could deserve a further investigation. Definitely. I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that, Eric. But.
No, I think that's well said. I think the term fake news, like you say, has been used a lot, and sometimes it can be used from a perspective of a whistleblower who's trying to raise an awareness that a piece of news is falsified, and it can also be used as a way to shut down journalism as well. So we need to be kind of careful and clarify. But in the end, I think the message, one of the messages of the film, is to just be critical. To be critical of information that is that is published, who is publishing it, what conflicts of interest might be, what their interest is. And so in this way, I think that if a viewer leaves the film by asking more questions about journalism, I think that's a good thing.
I completely agree. What is your now? This must have been in the works for years, I'm going to guess. Can you tell me about like what period of time it took to get this thing complete for your Slamdance debut?
Yeah, good question. Maybe like a year and a half of solid work. Like it's something that existed as an idea prior to that. And I think it wasn't until, and this whole idea, I think, of media and misinformation and propaganda and the intersection of that with human rights was an angle that was being worked on even longer. But it was about a year and a half from the time that we first encountered Chen Rui-Chung, who's kind of like the main character in this film. He's a gentleman who worked high up in one of the largest state media operations in China, and at the same time was a prisoner of the brainwashing centers and re-education because of his own later connection with Falun Gong. And he was adamant that this thing was staged, and he had been coerced by some senior officials in China as well. So we start from his story. But from the time that we encountered him is when the film, I think, really got moving. And it took about a year and a half from that until we submitted to Slamdance. And then, it was a race to get all the post work done. But
we took it to Park City kind of dripping wet. The ink was still drying on the page. It was, we submitted, I think, a rough
It was
cut.
maybe close to a fine cut. So it's like not what you're supposed to do when you're submitting, but we're just like, you know what? Even though it wasn't finished, we knew it's not going to change very much. We had like worked on this story and this angle and that angle, trying to figure it out, and we felt we finally cracked it and how we wanted to tell it. And so it was really just about polish. So we're like, let's just start submitting it. First submission, we got accepted.
Yeah, that's good.
It's good news and it's bad news too, because then you got to race to finish all the post work, right? So, but it was great. It was amazing. And in hindsight, now that everything's shut down, like, wow, how fortunate we were to have that premiere when a lot of filmmakers don't.
Yeah, it's literally like the last place you could have premiered. I mean, Sundance and Slamdance were the last sort of major public film festival. I mean, we were talking before we started recording about how Sundance is going to change its plans to this sort of like, variety of screenings
Different
all
cities,
over
that kind of stuff. Yeah.
I don't 100% know that's going to work. I think it's great for audiences. I don't know that it's necessarily great for filmmakers, but we live in a new age now. I do think actually this is kind of a golden age for indie filmmakers like yourselves, in the sense that, this is an opportunity for people looking for different types of content on VOD, available on VOD, to check out, because they at some point even Netflix will run out of shows. So that, and in a way it kind of democratizes everything, because look, you're getting the same releases as a lot of the major theatrical releases that have decided to just go VOD.
Right.
So what's that experience like now, putting your film out on VOD? And actually, technically, by the Academy rules, you would still be eligible for Oscar consideration in the documentary category, if I'm correct. I think that based on the rule change, you guys are eligible.
It's possible. I mean, those things are moving targets. So we were focused on our continued festival run. And we had other festivals we were really looking forward to being part of, and then kind of the rug just got pulled beneath our feet. So I mean, as an indie, now you're all in the same playing field. There definitely is that democratizing process between us and all of the other sort of larger studio productions. But at the same time, you're like, well, gee, how do I stay relevant and how do I stay connected with audiences? And so, I mentioned a little bit earlier on in the interview that we do video games and digital media here as well. And, we work in VR and produce VR content as well. And so we had these VR headsets sitting around, and that just sparked another idea. So we launched we partnered with one of the film festivals we were scheduled to play in, San Francisco's DocFest. And we organized a virtual reality sort of film festival style screening, where we were screening the film in the VR headsets in a virtual cinema. So the cinema was 3D, kind of virtual reality, immersive type thing. And we played our movie on it. And then we took everyone to the balcony, and we had, with avatars, we had like a Q&A, filmmaker Q&A, like you would have after a screening. And it was amazing because it was right in the midst of the time when, we couldn't associate with each other. We couldn't be together. But in the VR space, at least we could high five people and that kind of stuff. And we weren't worried about, spreading a virus. And it had similarities to what you experience in an actual festival screening. So, I mean, I guess for us, the answer is, as an indie, there's a more of a level playing field, but you still have to find, how do I connect with audiences then? And we just felt, with what's going on in China, with the initial cover up of the virus and what people have been enduring in Northwest China with the Uyghurs and what's going on in Hong Kong, there's too many issues in this film that are timely and relevant. And we needed to find a way to keep it in front of audiences. So we just moved into this kind of virtual space. And now, actually today, as we're giving this interview, the film is available on all the VOD platforms in North America, together with 1091, who's our distributor. So we had to pivot and find a way to make it all work.
Well, that's the thing, is like, it's always a struggle for independent filmmakers. So this pandemic is like nothing new, right?
Right.
Don't have enough money, don't have enough resources, but you still have to persevere. So I really admire what you guys have done. This is amazing. I hope they have free drinks at the VR screening.
There's popcorn and tomatoes. We asked them to not throw during the screening. Could you throw that at the end if you really don't like it? But the crowd was cool. Actually, people really connected with it. It was a really unique experience to be able to do that. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Eric and Jason, I want to thank you so much for being on the Film Threat podcast today. Ask No Questions in the Film, one of the best documentaries I've seen this year, truly remarkable. And you have to see it, especially just with what's happening today in the world. It could not be more relevant. I also want to thank our sponsor, Storyblocks. If you're a filmmaker watching this, go to storyblocks.com/filmthreat. It's stock footage, cleared music, resources for filmmakers, all sorts of tools, really affordable, and you should check them out. Storyblocks.com/filmthreat. Eric and Jason, thanks for being on the Film Threat podcast. I really appreciate it. This was awesome.
Thanks for having us, Chris.
Thanks for having us. Appreciate it.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.